Today to the fifth meeting for the School Funding Task Force. Day is Monday, October 18th, and I hereby call this meeting to order. I would just like to remind everybody, if you do have a cell phone, if you would please turn that to silent or vibrate. That would be greatly appreciated this morning. Also, we have some members that are participating remotely. When the roll is called, please indicate if you're home or if you're in your annex office or in your district. When you join the meeting, your microphones are automatically muted, so please remember to unmute your microphone before. If you have any question or comment during the meeting, please indicate that in the meeting's chat function. And a link to today's meeting materials was sent to members, and they are also available on the task force page on the LRC website. We do have a quorum, so Chris, if you would, I'm going to let you please call the roll.
Senator Givens, Senator Thomas, Senator Wilson, Representative Banta.
Here in the room.
Representative Bojanowski.
Here in the room.
Representative Johnson. I see you remote.
President, yep, here I am, President of the 13th District. Thank you.
Senator Wise.
Present in the room.
Senator Tipton, or Representative Tipton.
Great. Good to see our co-chair Tipton and everyone else in the audience this morning, and also those participating as well. Members, anybody have any comment, any questions before we get started? All right. Seeing none, our first item on the agenda today is with the Kentucky Department of Education. And during the 2021 regular session, the General Assembly passed House Bill 563, which included a provision allowing non-resident students to be included in a district's average daily attendance for the purposes of receiving state SEEK funding. The responsibilities of the task force include receiving a report from the Kentucky Department of Education regarding recommendations on how local funds may follow non-resident students. Today we have staff from KDE that will be available online to provide an overview of that report, and additionally they are available to respond to questions members may have from previous meetings. There is a copy of the PowerPoint in all members' materials folders, and this also can be found online on the task force website. So if those members of KDE that are joining us remotely, if you would, please identify yourselves for the record, and you may proceed with your presentation.
Hi, this is Che Ritter with the Kentucky Department of Education, Division Director of Division of District Support Services.
And good morning, this is Todd Allen, General Counsel for the Department of Education and State Board of Education.
Che and Todd, thank you all for being here this morning, and whichever one of you all wishes to proceed first, I'll let you go ahead and have the floor.
Sure, thank you, Senator Wise. I'm going to share a PowerPoint here, so give me just 1 second. And if you all could just let me know if you're seeing a School Funding Task Force PowerPoint in front of you.
We are, Che. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. So today we're going to talk about actually two different things, and it's a reasonably short presentation that we're going to go through. And obviously, at any time if you have questions, just let me know. So this is a preview of a KDE funding report. As Senator Wise mentioned, House Bill 563, and I'm sorry we have a little bit of an error on this slide, but House Bill 563 required the Kentucky Department of Education by November 1st to submit a report to talk about the equitable transfer of education funds so that funds can follow a non-resident student to a school district of enrollment from a school district of residence. A significant difference there. The report shall include recommendations on how the amount should be calculated and what mechanism should actually move the money itself or to conduct the transfer. So House Bill 405, sort of a similar bill in one sense. It created the School Funding Task Force, but the difference is that both of these require KDE to report the same information to some different entities, one being LRC and the Interim Joint Committee on Education, and House Bill 405 sends it to the School Funding Task Force, which obviously you all are part of. So same result, but this is mostly a preview of some of the stuff we've been working on. So under current law, non-resident student funding, KRS 157-350 permits districts to include non-resident students in the average daily attendance. And if you'll recall, this is ADA, sometimes AADA. This is basically a huge component of how school funding is calculated. So when listed under a written agreement between a non-resident district and the resident district, and the example I always use is Franklin County and Frankfort Independent, will have an agreement between the two about how many students each will accept from each district. So as the districts get these non-resident kids in their school, the staff at these schools will actually code these students inside of Infinite Campus, which records where these students are. So we can always look and see how many non-resident students there are in one district versus another, or in some cases you might have a district with agreements with 6 surrounding districts or something like that. So it's not necessarily just internal to a county. It can be next door and even several counties away. So House Bill 563 made some pretty significant changes to this, and the way the law was written. By July 1 of 2022, districts must adopt policy governing the terms under which a district shall allow enrollment of non-resident pupils. So in other words, the districts themselves are going to now have a new policy about non-resident students coming to their district. And beginning on that same date, districts may include the non-residents admitted under that policy in their ADA. So it would come into their funding for SEEK funding purposes. In other words, and sort of to put this in a very short description, there's no longer a need for the non-resident agreement between districts. However, I think it was 10 days ago, October 8th, there's a court case, a decision came out of there, and I'm going to read the whole case or anything for you, but this is a case, obviously you can see it in front of you, that we feel permanently enjoined the enforcement, pardon me, of House Bill 563. And if you recall in that case, it was the case itself, I think was the challenge was about the, I'm going to draw a blank here, the tax credit for private school students. So average daily attendance is also used throughout some other mechanisms that we fund on. SEEK funds is a big obvious one. Some state formula grants are also determined by average daily attendance as well. And then some federal funds are calculated using average daily attendance. Let me back up here. I think I skipped a slide there. Sorry about that, Senator Wise. Okay. So part of this, the recommendation, when we talk about local tax revenues, it's important to understand what's included there for school districts. So these are all, tax rates are going to be set by your local Board of Education. The big one is property tax. That's one most of us recognize pretty easily. If you own some property, be it a house, car, you're going to be paying a chunk of your taxes on that tax bill go to the schools. And it's usually a significant portion of that tax bill go to the school districts. And to keep in mind the reason too behind that in some cases is school districts are the only taxing entity that actually has a local effort deduction inside their funding formula. So in a sense, they're losing on the SEEK side, so they have to offset that through local taxes. It also, property tax also covers tangible property. And typically this is like equipment, business inventories, basically everything that's not property itself, like real estate, if you will. So then there's a group of permissive taxes, utility taxes, which is actually a tax on utility gross receipts. Most districts have this. Occupational taxes, which is a little different for school districts because for example, the city of Frankfort has occupational taxes, and you may have recently read, if you're a local, that they've lost quite a bit of money because state workers are not coming into Frankfort as much. And school districts, however, can only tax those residents who live and work inside that community. So if I'm Campbellsville and I have this tax, it would only hit those residents who live and work inside of Campbellsville. And then excise taxes are actually, no district does this, but it's a tax on a tax liability for the individual. So obviously it wouldn't be too popular, I would assume. So all these taxes are collected locally by the school districts, or in one case, the Department of Revenue does collect the utility taxes on behalf of districts, then they'll send them their amounts. Just for, I'm sure, logistical purposes, it's much easier for the Department of Revenue to do that than it is 100 plus school districts. So tax collection rates will vary by district. Most of the time, and when the economy is doing fine, you'll see some pretty consistent collection rates throughout the state. However, we do have areas that collection rates are pretty, dismal at times. If we go back several years when the economy was not doing so hot, in areas where unemployment's high and things like that, obviously people that aren't working usually don't or usually cannot pay property taxes, so collection rates can be impacted by that. So the Kentucky Department of Revenue, we don't ever really see this money as far as coming through our door. We don't touch it. It never kind of cycles through our department or anything like that. So some of the options for, we'll go through a couple of these, or these four.
Hey, Jay, can I stop you
Yes,
just real
sir.
quick? We have a question from Representative Tipton. What I'll do, if members, if that's okay, if we have questions on the particular slides as the KD is going through these, I just ask you to motion to Josh. We'll take a question. Let me go first, Senator Thomas. You don't care. Let me go to Representative Tipton since he was first in line, and then we'll follow with Senator Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Shay and Mr. Allen, appreciate you being here today. And my question, actually I've got 2 or 3 questions, but first question is in regard to the recent court decision. It's my understanding that the litigants in that only filed suit based on the OEA, the Education Opportunity Account portion. The actual litigation did not address the portion of the bill dealing with the transfer from one district to another, non-resident students, but I'm reading differing opinions. So is it the opinion of KDE that the court ruling enjoined the entire House Bill 563? Just for clarification before we go further.
Thank you, Representative Tipton. Yes, you're correct on most of the points that you've made there. And I've also, I will note, provided a full analysis to the committee staff, LRC staff there, that you can reference as well. So it goes into quite a bit of detail. But in short, you're correct that the plaintiffs in that suit only asked the court to declare certain sections of House Bill 563 unconstitutional. However, in the court's final order, it did not limit it to sections of House Bill 563 and declared the entirety of House Bill 563 unconstitutional. I think there are quite a few questions, and it's possible that the court may enter something clarifying that. But until we have that, based on the court's plain language and its order, it appears that the entirety of House Bill 563 was declared unconstitutional.
If I could follow up on
Please
that.
proceed.
Thank you. Of course, I think it's obvious this litigation is going to be appealed from everything that I understand and I'm reading. So we really don't know the final outcome of this. It's also possible that eventually the Supreme Court could sever the portions and ask. So I assume it's still a lot of unknowns here, I guess is my point, more of a comment than a question. So I appreciate you continuing to discuss this, because it's very possible that we still may be dealing with this when the final litigation is determined on this. Now, I do have a question related to your discussion about local funds, and I know that your portion here is talking about. So it's going forward on this. Your interpretation is that, and I think I would agree with this, that no local funds could transfer from one district to another, but it is a possibility there could be a mechanism in place that the state share of the funds could transfer. Are you all at a position to elaborate on that?
I think that's in the coming slides that Mr. Ritter's going to discuss.
Okay.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll defer on that, and this is really related to the OEA report from last week. And one thing that I just want clarification while I've got you here is one of the hypothetical situations that they gave us on the SEEK formula was increasing local support from 30 to 35 cents. Now, as I understand that, essentially every district already, there's no district below, I think, 42 point so many cents right now. So all districts are already levying that amount of tax rate. So essentially what happened, I want to make sure I understand that. Essentially in the SEEK formula, there's more local support, so the total SEEK calculation is greater, but without any changes, the state portion does not change, would not change. Could you just clarify that and make some comments on that so I have a better understanding of that recommendation?
Sure, Representative. And if I may, let me back up a little bit, make sure we're talking about the same thing. To be clear, every district, and when we calculate their SEEK funding, we reduce 30 cents per $100 of their property assessment. So over time, if we go back 10 years, and I'll pick on one of your home districts there, Spencer County, and their assessment, their local effort just hypothetically was $10 million, we would reduce that out of funding. And over time, assessments typically grow, somewhat in most communities. So that local effort, maybe over 10 years, has grown quite a bit. So as time goes on, if their assessments are growing, they will get a larger deduction from that local effort. That 30 cents actually grows. It's still 30 cents, but the other factor in that formula has grown, so the amount is a little higher. Now, I think to OEA's hypothetical about the 35 cents, what that essentially does is it provides you now have a higher amount that you're doing the math by. So instead of 30, it's 35. So you would actually be, the deduction for every district would be a bit larger. And I know I've looked through some of their scenarios as well. So that changes the dynamic a little bit between local and state funding. Because now the locals would actually, and I know we've got a couple in the room there probably, but they would have a larger portion, 5 cents more, if you will, reduced from their state funding just by default. And you are correct that every district is, in some cases, well above that 30-cent minimum. I'm not sure of the lowest we've got right now, but I'd say in the 40s somewhere is probably correct. I'd have to look to see where the lowest is. Does that help answer your question, Representative Tipton?
Thank you. Go ahead, Senator.
Senator Thomas.
Chairman Wise, actually, Representative Tipton asked my question, so I'm glad I got an answer on that. But Che, I do have another question for you, if I may.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Am I correct that as local effort increases due to the increase in property assessments and property revenues for a county, the amount of SEEK money goes down? For instance, I'm thinking of Fayette County, my home county. Mm-hmm. Every year their SEEK amount goes down because their property tax assessments go up and the amount of property taxes they collect go up. Am I correct on that?
Yes, generally speaking, that's exactly the case. So as property assessments increase, they're going to get less. And I'm kind of, reading this in a vacuum, that they're going to get less from the state, but they'll be able to generate more locally. So it's that sort of seesaw effect. As I'm able to collect more locally through local taxes and local revenue, I'm less dependent on the state for that state revenue. And alternatively, the other side of that is true too. If you're in a community that your assessment goes down for some reason, and this happens occasionally, that you'll actually get more support from the state through SEEK funding because your local revenue has decreased.
Representative Bojanowski. All good. Che, if you wished, please proceed. That was the last question.
All right. Thank you, sir. Well, I'm sorry. I think it skipped over one there. There we go. I'm sorry about that. So the considered options is one is just status quo. Local funds are not transferred or provided for. So we're talking about the real basics of this are I think the question boils down to how do local funds, how could they follow a student from, say, Campbellsville over to Taylor County or from Anderson to Boyle County? So option one is really just the status quo. Right now, they don't. That the local tax dollars stay in the community in which they're levied, if you will. So number two is the transfer of local funds from a resident to non-resident district. This would be, for example, from Franklin to Frankfort Independent. However, there's some issues we believe with Kentucky Constitution Section 180. And number three is the adjustment of SEEK itself. As Representative Tipton, you mentioned OEA's hypothetical of 5 cents more added to that local effort. And this is kind of along those same lines, is that one of the options would be to actually adjust SEEK itself to, create an amount that would, quote, follow the student over to a district. So in other words, you would credit one district where the student was attending and then deduct that amount from his or her home district, if you will. So this, of course, has some issues with the General Assembly's responsibility to provide adequate funding. Number four, this is a little more complicated, but a separate appropriation. And there are plenty of these inside of the SEEK budget. There's some other add-ons, if you will, but this will be equal to the local per pupil revenue in the attending district. You could also create a SEEK add-on for these non-resident students. Now, when I say SEEK add-on, if you go back a couple of meetings ago when we were talking about the very beginning of this, there are add-ons for exceptional children, limited English students, free lunch students, things like that. So this would effectively be just another add-on, if you will. And it does create sort of a timing issue because the way SEEK operates now is we're looking at, in a normal year, not quite this pandemic period, but in a normal year, we're always looking backwards at student counts with some rare exceptions. So we're looking back at last year's students to pay for this year. And I know Mr. Superintendent Borchers is in there. So the students that were in his district last year, I'm actually counting those in a normal year again, not a pandemic year, for his funding. So when you're trying to do this, students that have left the district, there would almost be a delay for that money to reach the new district because the way the students can flow back and forth, it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, for us to track and pay in a current year because these students can move back and forth pretty quickly. So when we talk about the issue with Section 180 of the Kentucky Constitution, and again, I'm no attorney, this should not be construed as legal advice, but that's one reason I've got Mr. Allen with me, is no tax levied and collected for one purpose shall be devoted to another purpose. The part two, I think the third option we gave you there, the responsibility of the General Assembly that came out of the Rose versus Council for Better Education. And also the reduction of a district SEEK funding may unconstitutionally shift the burden of adequate funding from the General Assembly to the local school district. So each of these considerations, with the exception of the status quo, we believe there are some legal questions behind.
Jay, I'm going to stop you real quick. We have a question from Superintendent Fletcher and Superintendent Borchers.
Mr. Rears, Robbie Fletcher, Lawrence County. A quick follow-up question when we were talking about the change in SEEK versus property value. Is it safe to say that if a district has a higher property value and then the SEEK funding decreases, that is not penny for penny? Again, there's so many funding add-ons and mechanisms. What I'm trying to say is I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, if a district has a higher property value and that increases, that is more beneficial to the district than how much that they lose in SEEK. Is that a safe assumption, or is that too broad?
It is not dollar for dollar. I think you're correct in that. And that too, there are cases, and we see this, and it's just the nature of tax collections and just the taxing process, that your assessments, as they go up, your 30-cent local effort is being reduced out of SEEK. And in some cases, especially larger companies, the tax revenue that you get from these larger companies, it may be protested, their assessments could be adjusted and things like that. But to get to your point in a roundabout way, absolutely, it's not dollar for dollar.
If I may follow up too, if we will recall back to the OEA report that was given, if you look at the discrepancy in equity, I think that's very evident by the property-rich districts versus the property-poor districts, if you will, because there's as much as almost a $3,000 difference between a quintile 1 and a quintile 5. So that would lend to this also too. So please remember, when we say that a property value goes up and a district SEEK goes down, that's not dollar for dollar. I just want to make that point.
Mike, go ahead.
Thank you. Che, could you speak a little with these non-resident agreements on how tuition plays into this?
Well, this is actually something we talked about last week, and you may have to help me along here because we've not looked. KDE is not really a party to these agreements. And I'll give you the example that Frankfort Independent in Franklin County, way back when I was a lot younger, a lot less gray hair, and was a student, if they hit a point where they've reached, for example, if they have an agreement with Franklin County, it says, we'll do a, 10 student swap, and that's it. So students who aren't part of that, the parents can pay tuition. And Superintendent Borchers, do you all have that in your district as well?
Correct. We have a $250 agreement, but we've had a lot of discussions in some of the other meetings that I think tuition could become part of an issue here with something with federal funding. Todd, am I right on that?
So there are a lot of issues with regard to tuition. The one that I'll highlight first is that the Rose decision, the Supreme Court decided back in the late 80s, which is probably the most language that we have from the state Supreme Court regarding our system of common schools in the state, was very clear that common schools must be free. There was really nothing that varied from that. It was very clear common schools must be free. So it follows that if we're talking about how we split up the common school fund to go to common schools and districts throughout the state, they should not be charging tuition to students and partaking in the common school fund. That I think is really the substantial constitutional question that charging of tuition creates. Now, there's a provision in statute that allows a school district to have a tuition arrangement with another school district where the two districts are paying one another tuition for a non-resident student. But actually charging that student or that parent, that's not free at that point in time, and that seems to violate the language that is clear in the Rose case.
Jay, we have a question from Ms. Devonna Page with Kentucky School Board.
Thank you, Senator Wise. I just really had a comment from a school board member's perspective. Boards levy taxes to operate the schools within their districts, and it would be very difficult for me to ask my community to raise the taxes if they thought that money was going to be transferred to a district outside of our community.
Seeing no further questions, Shay, please proceed.
Thank you. Okay, and sort of part two of this presentation is to talk a little bit about something that I know OEA may have mentioned. So as I mentioned a couple of times, we currently use average daily attendance as one of the primary numbers we use in our funding formula. And there was a question asked about average daily membership. So you've got ADA basically versus ADM, and we're going to talk a little bit about the differences. And this will get into the weeds a little bit, but we try to keep it reasonably high level. So with ADA, the generic example is if I'm a student and I'm there 100% of the time, I generate 1.0 of ADA. Pretty simple idea. If I'm there 95% of the time, I would generate 0.95 ADA. So just as a very generic example, if you imagine a whole school full of really good students that attend 100% of the time, that school would generate full ADA. However, as we know, kids get sick, miss school, and things like that. So there's this adjusted average daily attendance. And that's how that's one of the big basic numbers to calculate school funding. Now, there's some additions and subtractions in there to daily student attendance, and this is what we're going to pull into the final seat calculation. And our current system that we use to calculate all this, when I say system, it's a program. That current program stores all of these numbers, and that's eventually how we get to your seat funding for each district. So this gets a little deeper into the weeds, but it kind of gives you an idea of how ADA works. So we have to remove non-contract students, non-resident students, as obviously, as we just talked about, we don't pay SEEK funds for those students. And previously, and since, we've got that 1 year of full kindergarten funding, we actually used to use half of the kindergarten ADA. And I always joke, it's not because these are very short kids, it's just the way it's been done for years is the kindergarten funding was always half. Now, obviously, in this last go around, the General Assembly allowed us to do full kindergarten funding. So that was a huge, huge deal. So that we adjusted inside of this. So instead of subtracting out half of the kindergarten, we left a full kindergarten in there. So also there are some overage and underage students that don't qualify pursuant to a regulation. And then we're going to add on virtual school and performance-based learning students. So we're subtracting out one group and then we add in another group. So there's some further adjustments for low attendance days, and then low attendance weather days, and then also NTI, which you've heard a lot more in the last couple of years, but NTI existed before then, of course, too. So these are all adjustments basically done inside of another program we have to get a district's ADA for the year. And as I mentioned earlier, we're always looking behind us. So, and I'll pick on Lawrence County. I'm going to use his ADA from the prior year to fund him for the current year in a normal SEEK run, not during the pandemic, of course, because nothing's quite normal there. So when we talk about average daily membership, this is a very different concept. And so it's been, I think, 14 years since I've been at KDE. It was always ADA, ADA, ADA. And obviously the attendance part of that's an important part of that formula. Now, ADM is an enrollment count. So if you think of this as a school year, I'm going to start, say, August 30th and get out May 30th. There's this idea that your average daily membership is just the number of enrolled students over a certain period of time. So if you have 10 new students come in and say, I don't know, November, that begins to be added to your average. So that long stretch. And we did look at some other states to kind of see, and I've got a document, I believe it's from Mississippi, that does a little breakdown on these different ways to count average daily membership. You can do it throughout the whole year, part of the year. You can also do a single day snapshot. You could say at the end of September, we're going to take a snapshot of this and that's your number. You can also do, and I've seen this in some other states where they'll do a fall and spring count. So, I'm assuming, and this is probably not a great assumption, but I'm assuming the idea behind that is that as school starts, there's a little bit of flux in the numbers of kids that are coming in and out of the door. So by sometime in fall, that's settled down quite a bit. And then in the spring, you do another snapshot to see if there's any increase or decrease in that same population. And then you've got some enrollment count periods. You pick days or some kind of period of time to say, we're going to look at it through this stretch of dates, and that's going to be your average daily membership. So when we talk about any change to this type of system, we think a lot about transitioning from ADA to ADM. So some of the things we think about is, the accuracy. So with our average daily attendance, we have attendance audits. We have auditors that go out and work with districts throughout the year. They used to physically go out, and some now it's a little bit more virtual, but they still go out and literally go through paper and look at some of the way they code students and stuff and make sure it's accurate. So that's a very important part of this process is accuracy. Predictability. So from a district perspective, when you're budgeting, obviously like any business, you've got to look at your revenue, and what generates your revenue is students. So being able to budget off of your average daily membership may be a little bit different than your average daily attendance. And as these superintendents in the room will obviously tell you, they have to make hiring and a lot of decisions based on that budget that will impact their school district going forward. And then also budget stability. So, and we'll talk a little more about this in a second about, how do you wrap your head around when you change this from ADA to ADM, that transition might be a little bumpy for some districts because obviously right now we've been in this 2-year window where ADA has been sort of frozen, if you will. So one of the things they did probably 92 or so is they built in a hold harmless provision in SEEK. And I think we have 3 districts or a handful that qualify for that now, which create a floor of funding for those districts. So as we transitioned from, the funding many, many years ago, pre-CARA into CARA, this floor, hold harmless provision, was kind of put in place to keep these districts from, kind of falling off the cliff, if you will. So that kind of budget stability we think is pretty important, because as you transition, and we'll be very frank and honest about it, we have years and years and years of data, but obviously the way numbers behave to certain situations, ADA, for example, we know is impacted by attendance. Well, what impacts attendance? Health obviously does, weather, all kinds of things. As these superintendents will tell you, they pay close attention to attendance. We have conversations about it all the time. But average daily membership is a little bit different ball game, because attendance is not really the factor. It's about enrollment. So that transition from, what I mentioned earlier is prior year and current year, we as a department would have to logistically figure out how can we do this sort of the least harmful way to districts, obviously, but also what's a logistical way of doing it so we can get good quality data for these student counts to make sure these districts are being paid.
Jay, let me stop you
Yes.
real quick. Just a comment and a question from me. In other states, have you seen if a state has gone from ADA to ADM, how long was that transition to take place? And I guess what I'm looking at is we will be tasked to come up with recommendations. We don't know where those recommendations will go. I think we all understand of task force what we're charged with, and what ended up may become a reality or what not becomes reality. But if we were to put in there that the Commonwealth of Kentucky moves from ADA to ADM, would that need to be a year out to give you all enough time to do this type of transitioning, or how does that look from what you've seen, or maybe your opinion of what you would like to see?
Well, and frankly, my opinion on that, and thank you, that's a good question, Senator Wise. I think we always would ask for some breathing time to not only communicate this to districts, but logistically for us, we have a lot of systems, and these systems require a lot of changes and testing. It's very important, obviously, to make sure we're not going to break anything with this change. And I would say, and this is something we'll discuss internally at KD and come back to the task force if that's okay too. With my staff, especially that work inside these systems, to understand, to us, one part of this is it's just another number. So that's pretty simple and straightforward, but it's kind of getting the districts on board to make sure we're getting everyone on the same page as we're recording this right now. So we want to make sure that that data is what we call, scrubbed and clean, meaning it's accurate. We can very easily go in and audit it, and we say we got the exact same result as you did. So there's a sense of comfort there, if you will. So I would say, we're not going to need anything like 3 to 5 years, obviously. I think it's more of a question of, that a cycle of 1 year, and make sure that districts are also, on board as well, as far as, their folks are recording it correctly, we're able to audit it correctly, and everyone's on the same page, basically. Because at the end of the day, when you switch from ADA to ADM, it's, again, just another number in our system, but we just want to make sure it's a very accurate, very, suitable number. And one of the issues we talked about is a student, and that we don't think this would be a very frequent or very large number, but if you're looking at current year data, it becomes an issue if a student moves around a lot. He's at home in Anderson County, then goes to grandma's in Boyle County, then jumps to his uncle's house in Garrett County. So he could be theoretically part of 3 districts ADM. Now that's a kind of an extreme example, but it takes time for these districts to transfer records and to end enrollment, especially if this student is sort of, jumping around and not really telling people I'm moving to the next county over. So that's something our systems and our systems analysts would have to figure out the best way to actually approach a problem like that. Does that help, Senator Wise?
Very helpful. Thank you so much. We've got a flurry of questions coming in from committee members, so I'm going to go ahead and start taking those this time. First up is Superintendent Fletcher.
Thank you, Chairman Wise. It's more of a comment than a question, and I want to refer back to the report from last week. When we start talking about funding with ADM, are we going to approach this from the point of adequacy or equity, or something in between? And the reason why I say that is this. If you go to average daily membership, because OEA's report was centered on if the educational budget is not increased from the state version. So that being said, according to this budget, everybody's SEEK base would drop down to $3,699.55 per student. So that extra money is then dispersed among other districts. In other words, equity would be addressed. With that being said, if it's done in that way, then you're going to have the districts that are low average daily attendance are going to be winners, as we talked about, whereas the districts that are very high attendance are going to be losers. Now, if we approach this from adequacy and just say, okay, we're going to add on $285.5 million into the state budget, then everybody should increase. So when we say we're going to average daily membership, unless there's extra funding put in, this is really not going to help all districts. It's going to bring some down and bring some up. So again, I'd like to, whenever we talk about average daily membership or the other add-ons, just remember the difference between adequacy and equity. Equity is going to have some people that are going to lose money. For example, a quintile 1 district would gain $364, but a quintile district would go from $11,814 per student down to $10,642. So again, please keep that in mind as we go forward.
Point very well taken. Senator Thomas.
I guess, Chairman Wise, my question is probably directed to you as well as to Che, but I'll ask this question to Che. Che, I'm trying to find out the substantive difference between average daily attendance and average daily membership, and I've been sitting here racking my brain over this, but I guess the difference is you could have a student enrolled in a school district who does not attend school, and yet if you went to average daily membership formula, the school would still be paid for that student because he's an enrollee, as opposed to average daily attendance where the school wouldn't be paid for that student who was a member of the school district but did not attend. Is that the substantive difference here?
Yeah, I believe so, Senator. So when we're talking about one of the key differences, and this is, I think it's a pretty big philosophical change, because, simply put, the average daily attendance, that attendance being the key word there. So we're incentivizing attendance. So, and I know just from experience of working with districts, that's a huge focus is making sure the students are there. Now, with average daily membership, it's more like enrollment. Enrollment essentially is I belong to that school district. My name is on their books, basically. So if I'm there or not with average daily membership is not necessarily a factor. Now, nothing prevents some kind of other incentive for attendance. I'm not sure what it would be, but that's the difference between the two. Is one of them is really attendance driven. So if you and I are both students at the same high school and I'm there 50% of the time and you're there 90% of the time, that attendance is part of that funding for that school district. So ADM really changes that over to just enrollment. We're both members of that same high school. Our attendance is irrelevant in that case. Does that help answer your question, Senator?
I think that does answer my question.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Banta.
Thank you for your presentation. This is very interesting. I have a couple things, comments, and then kind of a question for you at the end. I kind of lean towards ADM just because I think with the whole pandemic and what we've seen with ADA, I think encouraging kids to come to school sick and it is just not a smart thing to do. Also, I don't understand why we worry so much about whether a couple kids get counted that may not be there all the time, because I'm telling you, it costs a lot of money to chase kids down. And we work harder on the kids that aren't there, driving out to their houses, trying to get them back. I mean, it costs a school district just as much when they're not there as when they are there. That's just sort of an opinion and experience thing. So I don't understand why we're worried if somebody, has somebody on enrollment, but they're only there 50% of the time. It doesn't matter because we're spending a lot of time and money on them anyway. Kids moving back and forth to districts, that costs districts money and time when kids are doing that. So again, I'm not worried about schools getting maybe, $100, $200, $300 extra dollars because a kid moved and we didn't catch it in time. Finally, I guess this is just kind of this is my dream. I would like to not worry so much about ADA and ADM, but I would like to have SEEK brought up to the cost of living that it should be at, and then we just stop dickering about all the smaller stuff. If we bring the cost seek up to the cost of living for the schools, then we don't have meetings about adding school nurses, adding school psychologists, adding school counselors. That is for the district to decide with their budget being fully funded and at what it should be at SEEK levels, because SEEK is so fair and it takes into account of everything. The quartiles just blow my mind. I don't like winners and losers in education. It's great in football, but it's not in education. So, gosh, I've been holding that in for a week. So thank you, Chairman, for your indulgence.
Representative, I appreciate those comments very much, and I ask also that you please use that as your charge during the recommendation phase that we'll get to later today with your comments that you made. Next up, Representative Tipton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And a lot of my comments are going to echo what Representative Banta said. I believe the main reason that this topic is being heavily considered right now is what we've been facing the last 19 to 20 months with COVID. Schools are having challenges. They're having to make very difficult decisions about whether to have school in person or not. And I think it's this whole, they understand that their next year's budget is based on their attendance right now, so it makes it very difficult decision making. Now, we have went in the regular session and in this recent special session and made some accommodations where they can use the ADM for 1819 or 1920, but folks, we can't continue to do that forever. We have to I think it's important that we set an effective, adequate, long-range policy going forward. And as far as going to ADM, I agree that the costs are there, regardless of whether or not that student is there in the school in that seat or not. The school is having to do that cost. And I also understand, for those out there that might be listening, I wouldn't classify the SEEK formula as algebra. It's more like calculus. And there's so many factors into it, so many things that can impact it. So we're going to have to, if we go this route, we're going to have to tread carefully and make sure that, as been mentioned, we do some kind of a smoothing effect for those districts that have lost attendance, because you've got districts out there that are gaining enrollment, you've got districts that are losing enrollment. So whether it's hold harmless, whether it's a smoothing effect, there's a lot of considerations to take, but I certainly would hope this would be one recommendation we would make to at least consider looking at and see if it is feasible, because we've got to have an effective policy going forward, because unfortunately, I don't see COVID going away anytime soon. I think it's here with us, and these school districts are going to have to continue to make these daily decisions. And I believe if we had a system based on enrollment, ADM, that it would be much easier for them to make those decisions.
Superintendent Borchers.
Well, I'd like to thank Representative Tipton and Representative Banta for their comments, because they're 100% correct. The one thing I just wanted to add, Senator Wise, was that when we do our budgeting, we do get our ADA funding, but as you just said, we have to plan as if all those students are there every single day. So whether it's on ADA, we're still planning as if we have our full membership. So I agree 100%. I just wanted to reiterate that you were exactly right. When we're doing all of our planning, it's with the membership. It's not with the ADA.
Next up, I thought we may get a meeting without a comment or a question, but Mr. Truesdale.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, but you knew better than that. And actually, I wasn't going to say anything at this point, but I just really, really want to stand up and cheer for what Representative Banta said and what Representative Tipton said to follow that. And to Superintendent Borcher's point, I mean, you have to employ a teacher for the entire classroom. It doesn't matter how many kids show up that day. And just from KDE standpoint and working with the legislature heading into this recent special session, so much time and energy was spent and has been spent over the last almost 2 years trying to figure out how to count attendance rather than focusing on what instructional models will help students most. And I really think that if we can get this right, a transition to membership will allow us to focus on what really reaches children the best and not about the financial side, which is very important, but it should not be our ultimate goal. So I really, really appreciate that. To Representative Banda's other point, it really sounds like we're talking about maybe more of a resource model. We figure out what do we need, and then how do we pay for it. I'm afraid that that might be expensive, but A, it has to be done, and B, there's probably no better time to do it than right now. So I'm excited about the conversation I think we're having. So thank you.
Senator Thomas.
Mr. Chair, let me offer a dissenting opinion on this point. And I need to go no farther than what we did in legislature back in 1915. I mean, in 2015, when we went to a performance funding model for higher education. What we said then as a legislature, and you might remember, Senator Wise, that was in your second year, in your first year as a member of the Senate. We said that we want to fund higher education based upon state universities that retain students and graduate students. In other words, we want to make sure that those students come through our state universities, pass classes in our state universities, and graduate from our state universities. That's what we want to emphasize. And we passed that as a legislature. Okay. Now, what we're saying today, and I couldn't disagree more with Representative Tipton and Representative Banda. What we're saying now, that all we want for our public schools, K through 12, is for students to say, we're a member, okay? Whether they come to class, whether they pass classes, whether they graduate, now becomes irrelevant. I think that practically is the worst approach to take. And I think that's a waste of taxpayers' money. The reason we went to an average daily attendance model back in '89 was because we said we want students to come to school. We want students to pass those classes. We want students to graduate. That's what we want state taxpayers to pay for. Not just they're on the rolls. So I think this, in my opinion, this is going absolutely in the wrong direction, and it's quite a contrast to what we're doing in higher education, where we're saying we want students to pass classes and to graduate.
Thank you, Senator Thomas. Representative Banta.
I'm going to owe Senator Thomas lunch after this, I think. But to kind of
disagree with you more.
And that's great. We're going to agree to disagree politely and kindly. I think teachers work harder. It drives a teacher absolutely out of their minds when kids are absent. Teachers will call kids themselves. They get kids into the building. It's more work for a teacher when a child is absent than it is when all of them are there. So I kind of see the system taking care of itself, because the whole role of a school is to have the kids there. They want them there, and they'll work very hard to get them there, and they'll take care of them when they're there. So just agree politely, agree to disagree. Thank you.
Very welcome. Chuck Truesdale.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to point out there that while I appreciate Senator Thomas's point, if you look at which districts have better attendance and which districts have lower attendance, low attendance is essentially a proxy for poverty and socioeconomic status. So by funding on attendance, we are punishing districts with large numbers of students in the gap groups. And I think if we want to get to true equity, I think ADM is a model to achieve that, or at least a positive first step. And I know Senator Thomas will probably disagree with me.
Chuck, I'm going to disagree with you, and I'll tell you why. I want to disagree with you. Okay? I've been a proponent since I came to the Senate. I've been on the Senate Education Committee since I got here. That if we really want to address issues like poverty and equity, we've got to do some certain things. We've got to fund early child education. Okay, that's a first step, and that's a proven step. If you read the literature, that's what the literature tells you, that to address issues like poverty and race, you've got to have early child education. Okay, and so I think that's the direction that we want to go. Okay, we don't want to use our taxpayer money to just enroll a child and then the child not come to school and then still fund their education. That I tell you, Chuck, that's a waste of taxpayer money. We don't do that in higher education now. To do it in public education, I think is a travesty for this state. We got to get our children in school and through high school and on to whatever they need to do to become a productive citizen.
I'm going to let Che continue with his presentation. I greatly appreciate all the comments. I know we'll get more into this as we get into the recommendation phase as well. But Che, for time purposes, if you would continue, greatly appreciate it.
Yes, sir. So on this slide, we've got pros and cons, and I want you to notice the question mark, because I think there will always be, and I'm thinking of a perspective as a person who talks to school districts pretty frequently about, the way we operate as school districts. So obviously ADA, the incentive is to boost attendance. And, when we talk about chronic absenteeism, this is obviously one of those things that, bothers everybody. Truancy bothers everybody. So I want to be very clear too that, and we'll talk about this at the very bottom, but I want to kind of move that to the top, because to me, this is a very important factor. And, the way we see this, we will always have to track attendance for security reasons alone and safety reasons. You need to know how many students are in your building and which students are where. This is even during today's work that we do during the pandemic, DPPs or the directors of pupil personnel are tracking where these students are, because if there's an incident or some kind of problem, they need to know where these students are. So obviously, I think Chuck may have talked about this a little bit, about the poverty, chronic health issues, other community related factors. And then ADA also favors districts obviously with higher attendance rates. So, this is if you go online and look through any studies, you'll see a lot of commentary about these disadvantaged students do tend to miss school more, ergo, the ADA is going to be lower for those districts. So back to this point about you still have to have teachers, and I think Superintendent Borchers had mentioned this, districts have fixed costs. It doesn't matter if 0 kids show up or every one of them. They still have facilities, they've got utility bills, insurance, you've got salaries, you got to pay your custodian to be there to clean, your teachers have to teach, the school and community nutrition staff will need to feed. Now, if you have a school with 90% attendance and 95% attendance, these folks working there are still going to be there and doing their same job. It's just with a few less students. So that cost remains pretty much constant no matter what. And we also use ADA for some federal reporting and some other state needs. Now, ADM is, if you try to lay it on the same line as ADA, ADM is a higher number for districts because that attendance factor and all those adjustments are, taken out. So your per pupil funding amount will appear lower, even though it may be the exact same dollar amount in aggregate. So that's something to be aware of. This ADM is a higher number. And there's some different administrative burdens on the district side. Like I mentioned, the people who actually track attendance and things today, this would be a change in their world, pretty significant change at that. And again, to really emphasize, we're always going to have to track attendance. This is, a safety issue that we just obviously need to know who's in the building at all times. And regardless, we'll just have to continue doing attendance. But as that line above it mentions, it's just a different type of administrative burden. So again, any questions that you have later, don't hesitate to reach out. Mr. Allen's information is on here as well as mine. We thank you for your time today too. We really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all once again.
We appreciate both of you all. Thank you for the presentation. It was excellent discussion, and thank you for the time and effort put into that. Any questions for any of the two presenters before we go offline? Co-Chair Tipton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I believe it was Senator Thomas at last week's meeting brought up some comments about the OEA report and some discrepancies with the way that KDE has done certain things. I know you sent us a written response to that. Would you all like to make some public comments about that and I know you gave some explanations. And while we're here, use this opportunity to discuss that portion of the OEA report.
Sure. Thank you, Representative Tipton. I'll just preface it and say, typically and historically, we've always responded in writing to the Office of Education Accountability, and we do the same thing to the State Auditor's Office. And I'll say this respectfully, we don't always agree with the Office of Education Accountability. We may have a differing opinion on some of their recommendations or findings, if you will. But we do agree, and as you'll note in some of the comments we made back, that if mistakes are being made in the formula, our sole job is to make sure that calculation is accurate. To that point, starting last week, we're already moving to make these changes immediately, as quickly as we can, and we're going to, work very hard to make sure these calculations are accurate. And that is, literally my purpose in life is to make sure these calculations are accurate for each district. Now, some of these are not going to be significant changes in the formula that are going to send tens of millions more dollars toward one district or anything like that. A lot of this was some loose ends that needed to be a lot tighter. We need to tighten the screws in the formula, if you will. But we take this stuff incredibly seriously, and we do the same with the State Auditor's Office. If they see that we're doing something that could be improved, we take this advice under consideration, and obviously it's our mandate, if you will, and as well as our responsibility to make sure this stuff is accurate. That's all there is to it. So we appreciate the opportunity to speak to that. Thanks for that opportunity, Representative.
Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have one specific question regarding your report. And I asked this because I have filed BR 275 full day kindergarten funding going forward, and in that report they stated that when the funds were put in the budget in this fiscal year, there was not equalization, and that's something the General Assembly should do going forward. Could you comment on that, about the importance of that and how that would work and the impact of that, whether it's equalized or not?
And which one was this?
This was on the full funding of kindergarten going forward. They said,
and including the statewide equalization
yes,
level?
And they said that we need to include statewide equalization.
Okay, sure. So the process, this would be a little convoluted, but we've already started discussions with the State Budget Director's Office. And our process will be going forward, we will set the statewide equalization level. And when full kindergarten funding was added, our budget proposal had already been sent to the governor's office. Obviously, the governor's budget proposal had been, out, and then you all did yours. So those students, that half of the kindergarten population, 50% of them weren't included in that statewide equalization. And I believe Office of Education Accountability kind of pointed it out for a couple reasons. One is the obvious, which is, well, the adjustment was never made to that. And for accuracy purposes, they're absolutely correct. But in our mind, too, to be clear, it was pretty late in the process when that was added. So to change the equalization level would have meant changing equalizations for almost every school district, basically. The entire Department of Education budget for SEEK would have necessarily shifted at least a little bit, not necessarily a whole lot, but a little bit anyway. So it will be important going forward, and this will be included in the calculation we do for the upcoming budget, that these students are included in that statewide. There's an average per pupil assessment calculation that we use that sets that equalization level. So that equalization level is in turn used to determine, for example, how much Superintendent Borcher's district will get in nickel equalization, tier 1 funding, the same for Dr. Fletcher down there, that, this equalization, but now we will include that full kindergarten if it's fully funded again. Of course, that's assuming that. Does that help answer your question, Representative Tipton?
Thank you.
Mr. Truesdale.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just to follow up, I think, on what Che was explaining, is that equalization level, which I think is $834,000 in this biennium, is set during the budget process. And that number is essentially derived from the property assessment numbers in the first year of the biennium as forecast. And the General Assembly has never changed that throughout the budget process as long as I've been involved in it. So that equalization level doesn't change from year 1 to year 2 of the biennium anyway. And so I think what Che was saying, and what I'm trying to add to that is like all things in SEEK, that is a self-correcting mechanism. So going forward, if we include all kindergarten students, and hopefully BR 275 passes this year, we all hope it does, that will be a self-correcting mechanism going forward. So I think that is a one-time situation that would never repeat itself if we fund kindergarten fully going forward.
Thank you, Chuck. Seeing no further questions or comments, Mr. Ritter, Mr. Allen, thank you all so much. And Todd, we do have unanimous consensus for you to keep the mustache. I just want you to know from committee members.
I agree.
Yeah, if you could stay the course with that, we would appreciate that in future presentations, Todd.
I'm glad you all enjoyed that. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you all.
You're welcome. The next and last portion of our presentation for today is to do a discussion of possible task force recommendations. I know we've got some members in here who've been a part of task force and working groups before, some others that have not been. Remember, we have 8 voting members, that made up of legislators. Then we have our non-voting attendees, that being those that are from KDE, superintendents, and Kentucky School Board Association. But I would like to have this time for us to have a really good in-depth, just like we had before this and what we've had in previous meetings, of have some good recommendations as we go forward. Remember, next month we'll be meeting on November the 8th, and with that date, we will take those recommendations. We can vote on those, or we can just submit those as co-chairs to LRC and to also the leadership of both the House and the Senate. So at this time, I'm happy to entertain any members that have possible recommendations as we go forward. I think the first one we have is Representative Bojanowski.
All right, so I've been uncharacteristically quiet during this meeting, but when we went over the OE, the report last week, I did make a request for additional data, and so definitely just on the surface, before I could make any recommendations, I'd want to see an evaluation of the impact on quintiles that are based on poverty, and also an evaluation of special education and at-risk impact that would include federal funds. But that's on the surface. I think that the big question here is that we need to go back and think about the calling in the Rose decision on adequacy. And just a brief quote: "A system of common schools must be adequately funded to achieve its goals and substantially uniform throughout the state so that every child in the state is provided with an equal opportunity to have an adequate education." In the report, there were some very alarming numbers. And we need to find out, before we change our SEEK formula, we need to really understand what is happening. Why do we have an increase from 33% to 60%, 66% of the students in quintile 5 designated at risk? Why are 20% of the students in quintile 1 special education students? What is going on societally that is impacting our students? And that's very important to try to meet the decision of adequacy. So while we may not be able to change the societal impacts on education, we definitely fully need to understand how those issues are impacting students so that we can make funding decisions that will give every child the opportunity to have an adequate education. So my recommendation at this point would be, before we go and change our SEEK formula, I think there needs to be a task force such as this that really digs into what is adequacy. How are we, how are we doing with our goals of public education as we have in statute, the eight goals? And it would include a study on why we have so many special education students, why we have so many at-risk students, and what is the research on how we can adequately educate all of our students. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Banta.
Yes, I would just like to completely agree with Representative Bojanowski. I would like to have all that data, but in the meantime, I would like to have the SEEK formula just brought up to the cost of living, not changing it, but I would like it to be raised to where it should be so that schools can adequately run while we're doing all the studies that you are saying, because I think they're very important. Thank you.
Superintendent Fletcher.
Thank you, Chairman Wise. Just a few recommendations from a superintendent standpoint and talking with other of our colleagues. I think two areas that we really feel that if we could come out of this general session with, we'd be very happy with. One of them is full-day kindergarten. That is a tremendous help to all districts. The second one is fully funding transportation. If you look at transportation that is something that I think almost all, except maybe 2 or 3 districts, transport students. And right now we're at 53% of funding. For us, that would be over $500,000 put back into our budget that we're having to bring from the local taxpayers, because it shifts that weight from SEEK funding into the local taxpayer. The last thing I'll say is we've talked a lot about adequacy and also inequity in all of our reports from OEA. I don't think they're mutually exclusive, and the reason for that is if we just like I said earlier, the OEA report basically was given in a way of how can we keep the state funding as is, or the state budget as is, and make these changes for equity purposes, such as at-risk students, such as rural districts, other items like that. Well, basically, again, what we're doing is if we don't add funding to the general budget, then we're taking away from some groups and adding to others. Now, I will tell you, I'll be the first to tell you that Lawrence County would benefit from a lot of this. But instead of bringing other districts to a lower rate or lower funding, I think it would be better to bring other districts up. And for example, the two examples I gave you are adequacy. Basically those are adequacy. In other words, extra funding is going to be added, and that'll bring everybody up. But as far as the others, if we do anything with an add-on, and even if we go from ADA to ADM, I would ask that the legislature would seriously consider some type of hold harmless. In other words, a district doesn't drop below current funding. Similar to what was done, I think we have 2 districts that are in quintile 5, Lyon County and Livingston County, are hold harmless districts. In other words, they don't drop below the 1990 funding pre-CARA. If the same type of thing would be enacted, and what would happen is we would bring our quintile 5 districts, our lower property districts, up without bringing the quintile 1 down. Now, also, too, if you'll notice, even with some of those add-ons, even your quintile 5 would lose money. So the formula itself doesn't guarantee a low property or low-valued property district from getting more money. So again, I think that's why it's so important to have a hold harmless type clause for us to stay where we are. Now that means, as everyone in this room is going to understand, more funding in the educational budget. We're going to have to find a funding stream.
Ms. Page.
Thank you, Senator Wise. I would echo my support for full-day kindergarten and fully funding transportation as well. But equity in funding at school districts across the Commonwealth, from the poorest to the wealthiest districts, was the foundation upon which Roe's decision and CARA were built. In order for the Commonwealth to continue to increase equity in funding to all districts, I have a few suggestions, and they go along with the spirit of what Representative Bana talked about earlier about there being no losers. I would advocate for adding a foster child care add-on onto the SEEK formula as recommended by OEA report. The estimate of the cost to the state budget was $1.2 million. It would increase equity in funding across all quintiles and support districts' efforts in educating students in foster care, many of which are actions specifically required either by the state or federal laws, but for which there is no specific funding set aside. Second, I would suggest adjusting the SEEK base formula to account for inflation. This would mean that the SEEK base amount would increase to $4,768. This adjustment would provide additional support to nearly all districts except one and increase funding equity across the Commonwealth, with the added effect of increasing the amount of add-ons for at-risk and exceptional children and English language learners. With regard to English language learners, the current add-on is $385, which is far too low. The factor for calculating that add-on needs to be reviewed and upwardly adjusted to more accurately reflect districts' cost of resources needed to educate English language learner students. Many districts serve large numbers of these students, and that is a fact that most people are not aware of. Finally, the report from OEA shows that districts have done their part since 1990 by raising their local property tax rates in an effort to provide a quality education to the children in their community. But over time, as the OEA report shows, not all districts, it shows that all districts serve more students in poverty and more exceptional students. And over the time, many programs have seen their funding be stagnant. And as one example in the OEA report, average teacher salaries have not grown along with inflation in many areas. State education funding as a whole has not grown at the same rate as other areas such as corrections and Medicaid. The time is right for the legislature to take some steps to increase funding from the state in an equitable fashion to all districts across the Commonwealth. And while I have the opportunity, I just want to say thank you to you, Senator Wise, and you, Representative Tipton, for including school board members and superintendents in this discussion. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for the kind words and thank you for your comments. Mr. Trudell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to echo Ms. Page's thanks for including non-legislators on this panel. And I want to point out, as you said earlier, that we are non-voting members of this panel. And so had we been, that motion on Todd Allen's mustache would not have passed unanimously, not even close. I'm just saying. On those points, I want to echo again the need for early childhood education, full-day kindergarten, transportation, because I think transportation is an equity issue, because the districts that lose out the most when we don't fully fund transportation are those rural districts that have a lot of miles to travel. And when they lose population, they don't all lose it in the same community. It's evenly distributed, and so those buses still have to run the same piece. I do support the idea of a foster care add-on. But I think when we're looking at those add-ons, when those were set back in the early 90s, those weights were set by research and the additional cost of educating those students adequately. And so I think the time is ripe for us to conduct another study or contract for another study to see what are the actual costs of educating those exceptional students. I think if you set a foster care add-on, it should not be a number picked out of whole cloth. I think that should be done based on the added costs of educating foster students. When you're looking at those exceptional students, if you look back at the statute, the way the exceptional children was originally envisioned, gifted and talented students were part of that cohort. And we have moved those into a separate bucket of money in the LARS budget unit, but that has not increased with SEEK over time. And to that same point, and I'm sorry if I'm on a soapbox here, but we tend to think of, when we're talking about these quintiles, we tend to think of the quintiles as being uniform. All the districts in quintile 1 are the same. All the districts in quintile 5 are the same. And that is not the case. When we think of individual districts, not all students in Lawrence County are the same. Not all students in Ludlow or Jefferson or Fayette or any of them. They're not evenly distributed. Those larger districts, and Senator Thomas, you know this as well as anyone, you've got brilliant, gifted, and talented students in some of the lowest performing schools in Fayette County, such as Windburn. And you've got some very low performing students in the quote unquote best schools across the state. And so, I think we need to stop thinking about educating districts, educating schools, and more focused on educating students. And I think the SEEK formula is geared toward that. So I think that's one thing that we can really look at. But when we focus on SEEK, I think we leave out some of the other items. And I'm on board with including more things in SEEK as can be equitably done. One of those is we've sort of, I won't say glossed over facilities, but facilities are a source of huge inequities in this Commonwealth. And there is a local component to funding that. But quite frankly, there are some districts that can't get local support for raising additional funds for facilities. And at some point, we are going to run into the very serious problem of having almost palaces in some districts and crumbling WPA era buildings in other districts. And I think we need to maybe, one of my recommendations would be we look at a deeper dive into school facilities maybe next year or at some time in the near future. Career tech education is another area where we have deeply inequitable funding. And that's not based on the number of students. That's not based on the courses they take. It's based entirely on, well, when did you start your program? And if you met the cutoff date, then, hey, you get funding. If not, you don't get funding. And I think we really need to have better equity in our career tech funding, because that is a growing sector in Kentucky education, and it should be a growing sector. And we need to encourage that and build for those jobs for the future, because, as I've said a number of times, we want those 5,000 jobs created by Ford to go to Kentucky-grown students and not move people in from out of state. And those Ford jobs are not just going to be located in Glendale. It's just going to be like Toyota was in the 80s. You're going to have all this growth throughout the state for those suppliers. And that's why we need CTE students throughout the state and not just in that one location. And the final thing I'll say before I get off my soapbox is when we're talking about fully funded things, talking about kindergarten, talking about fully funding transportation, I'd like to see 2019 Senate Bill 1 fully funded. I think we need more mental health professionals, and that is a huge equity issue. And I think that goes back to what Representative Banta said about sort of that resource allocation. We need to fund the things that need to be funded. And that is one area that, back in CARA, one of the big things, if nothing else, was Friskies. And I think this is the modern equivalent of Friskies, is getting students those supports that they need so that when they walk into the classroom, they're ready to learn and not focused on all of the other issues that they're dealing with. I want them focused on math and reading and history and science, and not their home life situation or thoughts of suicide or other mental problems that they may be having, other behavioral issues they may be having. So that's a lot, but I think this task force has made a lot of effort to learn about a lot of things, and we may have bitten off more than we can chew, but I think nobody's going to fault us for doing that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chuck, I can't thank you enough for your comments, and your institutional knowledge does not go unnoticed of how much of an important asset you are to KDE and as well as to the Commonwealth. So thank you for each and every one of those comments that you made. I could not agree more about facilities. If there's one thing as a legislator, I think I maybe could speak for all 138 members. We hear a lot from our superintendents in our districts is about facilities. And I think that will always going to be there. And I do think that maybe looking at that from a task force issue is something we've brought before members of Facilities Commission in front of Education in the interim, but I do think that needs to be something that we look at as well. Superintendent Fletcher.
I want to echo what Mr. Truesdale said again about facilities and everything from top to bottom of what was mentioned. There is such an inequity across our state when it comes to facilities. But the other reason why I wanted to take this opportunity to thank members of this group for allowing superintendents to be represented, or for allowing other members from KDE to also to KSBA, or I'm sorry, School Board Association. It's deeply appreciated, and it shows that you're interested in our input. And again, from all superintendents, we really want to thank you.
Thank you for the comments. Greatly appreciated. And thanks for all the participation from everybody. Co-Chair Tipton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll echo those comments. I truly appreciate everyone's participation in this process. This is an enormous task that we have undertaken, and I think it's important for us to understand that these are issues we're not going to resolve in the next session totally. This is something we need to be looking at and working on for the next several years as we evaluate these processes. I'd like to take a moment and just review what the legislation charges this task force with doing. Review the entirety of the current K-12 funding mechanism and how Kentucky school funding mechanism compares with mechanisms developed by other states. Develop and submit any recommendations and changes the task force may adopt relating to the SEEK Fund to ensure the equitable and efficient funding of Kentucky's common schools to the Legislative Research Commission, and I think also to the Interim Joint Committee on Education. Last 5 years I've had the opportunity to serve on the House Education Committee. I've also had the privilege and opportunity to serve on the House Appropriations and Revenue Committee. So I have been in many of these budget discussions. I was honored to serve on the Budget Task Force, the Conference Committee for the budget in 18 and the 20 sessions. So I've been very much involved in these discussions in the past few years. And a lot of the things we've talked about are the mechanisms, and I understand there is a deep desire to see additional funding. I will point out those are typically budget decisions. You mentioned transportation. Statute already says we fully fund transportation, but that's been not withstood since 2004. And I think we all understand the history of some of the financial economic difficulties that the state has faced, particularly the downturn in the economy in 2008. We've seen some improvement. I know people in the education community are very much aware. There were, I think it was from 08 to maybe 16, the teachers' retirement system was not fully funded. From back a little after 2000 to about 14, the KRS system wasn't fully funded. We've made the commitment to do that, so that's taken a lot of additional funds. Back in the 2020 Budget Conference Committee, if COVID hadn't come around, I think we would have seen an increase in the SEEK funding during that session. We would have possibly seen an increase in the preschool allotment from 160% to 200%. Those are things that were being discussed. Unfortunately, COVID came. We did not know what the financial outlook was going to be, so some decisions were made to basically hold tight to our existing budget. Now we're in 2022. I am relieved that the impact of COVID and the response to the economy afterward has not been as severe as some of us thought it might be. So we are in a unique situation to make some very important decisions. And just like education, I can already tell you I've had many meeting requests from many different entities requesting additional funding going into 2022. So we just remember we're making recommendations on the mechanism, but the real discussions are going to be when we get into the budget discussion. So I just want to remind everybody of that. And I think we've had a lot of good comments made here, and I'll certainly be considering them between now and our next meeting. And thank everybody for their participation.
Co-Chair Tipton, thank you. I want to thank you for your leadership on this task force. I appreciate always your indulgence in you getting into the issue. I appreciate your research. You're a very thoughtful legislator, and I appreciate the time and commitment you've made to this. I want to thank all of the other legislators that have been participants in this as we've been charged to go forward. And I also want to thank all of our non-voting members. I think the only way to be effective in the job that we can do in Frankfort is to listen to all sides and bring everyone to the table. And I think that was a charge that this group has done very well in a very complex issue. Going into becoming a legislator, I never knew the complexities of the SEEK formula. I'm not for sure when I leave as a legislator, I will understand all the complexities of the SEEK formula. But I also want to thank KDE and all of the presenters through this entire process that have brought this down to a very good common sense understanding for many of us. And I cannot thank all of the presenters and everyone that we've had present to us this entire interim. So thank each and every one of you. So we will go forward next month on November 8th. We will take these recommendations under consideration. We will work with LRC to put out a draft of what we will either vote on or we may not vote on. We'll see where we're at in terms of November 8th. But if I see no further comments, no further questions, anybody online wishing to make any closing comments? Perfect. I ask for a motion for adjournment. So thank you so much. We'll see you all November 8th, 10 a.m., room 149. Thank you.